Many people looking at world politics and the events taking place in front of their eyes have a feeling that double standards are always in operation. They may not know exactly what these standards are, how they are applied, but at times it becomes very public and very open. Take, for instance, the bringing down of the Malaysian jet in the Ukraine by we don't know who. We have a suspicion, but we're not 100% sure. There is no proof, no evidence has been supplied as to who brought the plane down, whose missiles targeted the plane. A great deal of material is circulating, indicating that official Ukrainian government bomber jets were up in the air at the same time. So we don't know. We have a suspicion. And the suspicion is that missiles supplied by Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, to the rebels in the Ukraine and designed effectively to aid the rebels to bring down those bombing them, were accidentally used to bring down a plane which they had assumed was a Ukrainian bomber jet. I say this is what is assumed. We still don't have the evidence. It's probably quite likely that that is what happened, but given the way in which the world is governed, it's difficult to know. And yet, the coverage of the Western media on this particular plane and how it was brought down showed no signs of any investigation, no doubt at all. If you look at the newspaper headlines in the European press and in the United States, it was clear. It was Putin, Russia was going to be targeted, etc. But some people in the United States, including some journalists, were a bit horrified by this and began to pose questions. For instance, State Department spokesman Murray Harf was challenged by Associated Press reporter Matthew Lee, who courageously demanded something all journalists should do, but they don't, that Harf back up her claims that Russia had been firing rounds into the Ukraine with something more substantial than the rubbish she'd read on Twitter. This is what the Associated Press journalist said to her.
I think that it would be best for all concerned.
Are there any other questions?
If when you make an allegation like that, you're able to back it up with something more than just because I say so.
That's not what I said. It's based on intelligence information. It's not because I said so.
It's not me that's making these allegations. I mean, you guys get up at the UN Security Council, make these allegations. The Secretary gets on the Sunday shows and make these allegations. And then when you present your evidence to back up those allegations, it has appeared to, at least for some, fall short of definitive proof.
I would strongly disagree with that.
Okay.
To this question, Ms. Harf had no coherent response. She was silenced because she was not used to US journalists in particular, but Western journalists in general, asking critical questions at press conferences. That is something that used to happen many decades ago. So the question from the AP reporter stung her. Why? Because the global media networks, in most cases, 99.9%, I would suggest, have become a central pillar of Western government policies. All the criticisms that used to be made in the old days of how the Russian press functioned under Brezhnev, etc., the mainstream media, especially the tabloid end of it, functions in exactly the same way. No questions are asked. Government handouts are sometimes published verbatim. So when a journalist actually decides to ask a question saying, hey, where's the proof? The person at the other end, whether it's the presidential press spokesman at the White House or a State Department spokeswoman or whatever, are not prepared for this. and get a bit flustered. What we have not seen is any serious, consistent attempt by Western journalists to contextualize the dispute between the Americans and the Russians at the present time, why it is taking place, because only if you do that can you understand why this hysteria. There have, after all, been other plane crashes before, to which I'll come in a moment, but why this hysteria, which is effectively creating unnecessary tensions with Russia and between Russia and the Ukraine. Once again, it seems that Russia and the United States are finding it difficult to agree on how to deal with their respective ambitions. This clash of interests is highlighted by the current crisis over the Ukraine. The provocation in this particular instance, as the leaked recording of a US diplomat, Victoria Nuland, suggests, came from Washington. But it's not new.
Oh, one more wrinkle for you, Jeff?
Yeah.
I can't remember if I told you this or if I only told Washington this, that when I talked to Jeff Feltman this morning, he had a new name for the UN guy, Robert Seri. Did I write you that this morning?
Yeah, I saw that.
He's now gotten both Seri and Ban Ki-moon to agree that Seri could come in Monday or Tuesday.
Okay.
So that would be great, I think, to help glue this thing and have the UN help glue it. And, fuck the EU.
No, exactly. And I think we've got to do something to make it stick together, because you can be pretty sure that if it does start to gain altitude, the Russians will be working behind the scenes to try to torpedo it.
Several decades ago, at the height of the Cold War, George Kennan, a leading American foreign policy strategist, invited to give the Reith Lectures on the BBC, very close to the State Department, highly respected, informed his audience, and I quote, "There is, let me assure you, nothing in nature more egocentric than embattled democracy. It soon becomes the victim of its own propaganda. It then tends to attach to its own cause an absolute value which distorts its own vision. Its enemy becomes the embodiment of all evil. Its own side is the center of all virtue." And so it continues. Washington today knows that the Ukraine has always been a delicate issue for Moscow. Why? The ultra-nationalist Ukrainians fought with the Third Reich, with the Nazis during the Second World War. They killed 30,000 Russian soldiers and communists. They were still conducting a covert war with CIA backing as late as 1951. Pavel Sudoplatov, a Soviet intelligence chief, wrote in 1994, after the fall of communism, "The origins of the Cold War are closely interwoven with Western support for nationalist unrest in the Baltic areas in Western Ukraine." Move a few years beyond that. When Gorbachev agreed the deal on German reunification, the cornerstone of which was that a unified Germany would remain in NATO, US Secretary of State Baker assured him that there would be no extension of NATO's jurisdiction 1 inch to the east. Those were Baker's words. Gorbachev repeated, "Any extension of the zone of NATO is unacceptable." Baker's response, "I agree." One reason that Gorbachev, normally critical of Putin, has now publicly supported him on the annexation of the Crimea is that his trust in the West was so cruelly betrayed. As long as Washington believed that Russian leaders would blindly do its bidding, which Yeltsin often did while he was blind drunk, it supported Moscow. Yeltsin's attack on the Russian parliament in 1993 was justified in the Western media. The wholesale assaults on Chechnya by Yeltsin and then by Putin were treated as a little local problem with support from George Bush and Tony Blair. Chechnya isn't Kosovo, said Blair after his meeting with Putin in 2000. Chechnya had enjoyed de facto independence from 1991 to 94. Its people had observed the speed with which the Baltic republics had been allowed independence and wanted the same for themselves. Instead, they were bombarded. Grozny, the capital, was virtually reduced to dust. 85% of its housing was destroyed. In February 1995, two courageous Russian economists, Andrei Illarionov and Boris Levin, published a text in Moscow News arguing in favor of Chechen independence, and the paper, unlike its Western counterparts, also published some excellent critical reports that revealed atrocities on a huge scale, eclipsing the siege of Sarajevo, the massacre of Srebrenica. Rape, torture, homeless refugees, and tens of thousands dead was the fate of the Chechen people. No problem here for Washington and its European Union allies. In the calculus of Western interests, there is no suffering, whatever its scale, which cannot be justified. Chechens, Palestinians, Iraqis, Afghans, Pakistanis are of little importance. Nonetheless, the contrast between the West's attitude to the Chechen War and Crimea is startling. The Crimean affair led to barely any loss of life, and the population, or so it seems, clearly wanted to be part of Russia. The White House's reaction has been the opposite of its reaction to Chechnya. Why? Because Putin, unlike Yeltsin, is refusing to play ball anymore on things that really matter, such as NATO expansion, sanctions on Iran, Syria, etc. What Russia is doing now is defending and protecting its own interests, as big states tend to do. But the result of this is that Putin has become evil incarnate. And all this because he has decided to contest American hegemony by using the methods often deployed by the West. France's repeated incursions in Africa are but one example. Now, it's in this context that we really have to understand what is taking place with the hue and cry over the bomber. Effectively, whoever brought the Malaysian Airlines passenger plane down, it was an accident. Most occasions on which planes have been brought down are accidents. And yet this incident, if compared to the downing of the Iranian Airbus in 1988, has been exaggerated beyond all reality. Accidents happen, they're unfortunate, people apologize for them sooner or later. And if you compare this to the coverage in the media when the US ship, warship, Vincennes, knocked down an Iranian passenger plane from the skies. It had a gung-ho captain who wasn't too keen on ascertaining the exact identity of the plane. After all, they were Iranians. But yet the context in that case, which happened in 1988, in the preceding century, is not unimportant. Why? Because 1988 was the year in which Iran and Iraq were fighting a war. And in this war, the United States and its vassal states and supporters were backing Iraq. Iraq was at that time ruled by Saddam Hussein. Some of the worst atrocities by Saddam Hussein were carried out when he was being backed by the West in the war against Iran. That's when chemical weapons were used on Halabja against the Kurdish people. With the backing of the West, no criticism at the time. So in this situation, given that the West was politically and ideologically backing Saddam against the Iranians, they were also arming him and giving him help in terms of weapon supplies, etc. The Iranian plane had taken off from a port town of Bandar Abbas. It was headed for Dubai. It was sighted on American radar, and the order was given by the captain to bring it down. He assumed it was an Iranian bomber. To be fair, he did not know it was a passenger plane, even though he was deeply reactionary, totally chauvinist, not prepared to listen to reason from some of his colleagues. Nonetheless, even he had no idea that it was a passenger airliner. He believed that what they were watching was an Iranian bomber flying to participate in the Iran-Iraq war. So he ordered the plane was shot down. The 274 passengers on the Airbus comprised 209 adults, 57 children, and 8 infants. All of these 238 were Iranian nationals, 10 Indian citizens, 6 were from Yugoslavia and Pakistan, 13 from the United Arab Emirates, and 1 Italian national. All the 16 crew members were Iranian nationals. This flight was shot down on the 3rd of July, 1988. Now, if you compare the coverage which that incident received in the media and compare it to the coverage which the knocking down of the Malaysian airliner is receiving, there's no comparison. It was reported, certainly. It was reported it was a passenger plane. Did a single Western newspaper publish the names of those who died? Iranian names? Yugoslav names? No. It was an accident, and for years the United States did not admit that they were responsible for this. The crew of this ship, including the captain, were all awarded medals of honor. Finally, the United States admitted that they were responsible. There was no apology, but compensation was paid to Iran and the relatives of those who were killed. It was an accident, just like the accident that took place above the Ukraine, but the way it was dealt with in the global media and by the so-called international community was extremely different. They didn't quite justify it. The United Nations Security Council actually passed a resolution saying it was an appalling act of piracy in Iranian waters, because the ship was in Iranian waters at the time. Nothing happened. So without understanding the political context, the global context in which these actions take place, it is not easy to understand why they take place and how the media reports them. And times were different. 1988, the United States weren't in total charge of the world, but still they got away with it. Today they're in total charge, or think they are, of large parts of the world, and they can manipulate the media as they please. But an interesting development took place, that a number of senior intelligence officers, people who had worked for the United States, came out and published an open letter signed by intelligence veterans. These are all American citizens. They've all served the United States. Some of them worked for the National Security Agency. Some of them were involved in helping to cover up what took place when the Korean airliner was downed in Soviet airspace many decades ago. But that was the other plane that was knocked down. And what is interesting is that a lot of these veteran intelligence agents are now extremely concerned at how this event is being manipulated. Recently, they wrote a public letter to whoever cared to read it, Obama, the State Department, etc. But it was addressed to the president in the White House. And this is what they wrote, and I quote, "Your administration has not provided any satellite imagery showing that the separatists had such weaponry." They mean the Ukrainian separatists. "And there are several other dogs that have not barked. Washington's credibility and your own will continue to erode should you be unwilling or unable to present more tangible evidence behind administration claims." And then they went on and reminded Obama of what had happened, because some of them were involved in this, when the Korean airliner was shot out of the sky by Soviet jets for refusing to identify itself. The words in which they themselves put it are interesting. "Hours after the tragic shoot-down on August the 30th, 1983, the Reagan administration used its very accomplished propaganda machine to twist the available intelligence on Soviet culpability for the killing of all 269 people aboard KAL 007. The airliner was shot down after it strayed hundreds of miles off course and penetrated Russia's airspace over sensitive military facilities in Kamchatka and Sakhalin Island. The Soviet pilot tried to signal the plane to land, but the KAL pilots did not respond to the repeated warnings. Amid confusion about the plane's identity, a US spy plane had been in the vicinity hours earlier. Soviet ground control ordered the pilot to fire. This is what these intelligence agencies are informing Obama of what happened, even when they had all the evidence that it was the Soviet Union that had knocked down the flight, and that that flight was a passenger flight. But what they showed was how the reality had been manipulated. The Russians were, of course, at the time stunned themselves, and apologies were handed out, etc., etc. Then the agents go on in their open letter to say the following: "Regarding the Malaysian Airlines shoot-down of July the 17th, we believe Kerry has typically rushed to judgment, and that his incredible record for credibility poses a huge disadvantage in the diplomatic and propaganda maneuvering vis-à-vis Russia. We suggest you call a halt to this misbegotten public diplomacy offensive. If, however, you decide to press on anyway, we suggest you try to find a less tarnished statesman or woman." This letter is signed by William Binney, former technical director, World Geopolitical and Military Analysis of the National Security Agency, a co-founder of SIGINT, Automation Research Center; Larry Johnson, CIA and State Department, retired; Edward Loomis, National Security Agency cryptologic computer scientist; David McMichael, National Intelligence Council; Ray McGovern, former U.S. Army Infantry Intelligence Officer and CIA analyst; Elizabeth Murray, Deputy National Intelligence Officer for the Middle East; Colleen Rowley, Division Counsel and Special Agent FBI; Peter Van Buren, U.S. Department of State Foreign Service Officer; Ann Wright, Colonel, U.S. Army, retired Foreign Service Officer. Now, the fact that all these people are retired is the only time they can speak the truth. If they told the truth when they were not retired, they could have been arrested and charged with treason or something else, like Chelsea Manning has been. But the fact that they have still decided to come out, despite the fact that virtually all of them, if not each and every one, are staunch supporters of the United States and its standing in the world, is an indication of how difficult it is to ascertain the truth. Difficult for normal people, difficult for citizens who are fed these images day in and day out, or see the television news headlines and have no alternative information to question or to challenge. And it was, in fact, a former American president, Eisenhower, who in his retiring speech spoke of the powers of the military-industrial complex to manipulate news, to manipulate information. The questions posed by Eisenhower in his farewell address in the 1950s are far more cogent now, because the grip of the global media on the information networks of the world is so strong that the majority of the world's population gets its opinions in the West from global media chains linked up to governments, intelligence agencies, and supplying information which the government believes should be given out. If it were not for them, there would be many questions asked. Or if investigative journalism was still taking place on a serious level, many, many more questions would be asked, as are occasionally asked by the AP reporter or by the former intelligence agents. This is not being done by the mainstream media, and so it puts into question democracy. Because if citizens are not aware of what is really going on, do they have the information, the basis on which to exercise their only democratic right these days, which is the right to vote? That is a question to which we will return later in this program.